It's so bad. Heard it? No. It's just like, for some reason, it's just stuck in my head.
That mic's not working. Don't worry about that mic.
Alright guys, I think we're going to get started. I think our mic needs batteries or something, so we're going to have to project, but I think we can make it work. Welcome to the second day of Darwin Week 2012. Our next talk is entitled No Strings Attached, Hookups, Personality, and Sexual Regret at UNI. Dr. Gary Gute is an Associate Professor of Family Studies in the School of Applied Human Sciences at UNI. He holds a PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from Iowa State University. His research interests include undergraduate sexual behavior, the family's influence in shaping creative achievement in children, and the development of psychological complexity in creative persons. Dr. Elaine Eshbaugh is also an Associate Professor of Family Studies in the School of Applied Human Sciences at UNI. She holds a PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from Iowa State University. Her research interests include depression and loneliness across the lifespan, older women who live alone, predictors of student interest in gerontology, and college student sexuality. So without further ado, let's welcome our speakers, Dr. Gary Gute and Dr. Elaine Eshbaugh.
And thank you. All right, let's get down to business. For those of you who came, when you saw the title, saw any publicity on this, and you came because you thought it would be salacious or titillating or something like that, this is the extent of that. So
we don't want to disappoint.
Yeah, feast your eyes on this. Hopefully this will take care of that need if you came here with that need, and we'll get on to other stuff. I guess I'll get up here for a minute. Several years ago, it's more interested in the other stuff. Several years ago, Elaine and I started collecting some data on undergraduate casual sex hooking up behaviors. Our motivation was primarily looking at health risks that were associated with students engaging in hooking up behaviors. And we were really pretty much at the start of the research on that. That was back in 2008, and we did 3 articles that were published in 2008 dealing with casual sex and hooking up. And since then, there's been a lot of additional research that others have done on casual sex and hooking up. We were asked today to come in and talk about some of our research. So what we're going to do is give you just a real quick tour of 3 of the studies that we did on casual sex and hooking up. And these are all available. If you go to the library, you can find them, you can download them. If you want the articles, you can email one of us and request any or all of them, and we'd be happy to send them to you if you have an interest. The first one we're going to talk about is our study looking at personality as a predictor of hooking up among college students. I've got a few slides here just to get us through some of the background information, a quick, very quick review of literature, and then Elaine's going to talk about our method and our findings. We define hooking up in the same way that Paul, who was one of the pioneers really in the study of hooking up, defined hooking up. That is, sexual encounters that may or may not include intercourse, usually occurring on only one occasion between strangers or brief acquaintances. And it's been well documented as commonplace. There's a fairly long history of research documenting that hooking up, defined this way, is quite prevalent on American college campuses. Paul has done the largest study of hooking up. It was at a Northeastern university, 555 participants, and found that 78% of that sample had experienced at least one hookup, using the definition that we just looked at. 40% of men and 33% of women had engaged in intercourse when hooking up, and of course the others engaged in other sexual behaviors. We are especially interested in looking at the relationship between personality and hooking up. If people with some personality traits are more predisposed toward hooking up than people with other personality traits. But not everyone has looked at that. In fact, very few people have looked at that. Most researchers have looked at the role of alcohol. When you think about hooking up, you think about the constellation of variables involved in a hookup, Alcohol is usually one that you probably think of would be at the top of your list. And a lot of researchers have looked at that. And they've presumed, and some of the research has demonstrated, that it is, if not an important, certainly even one of the most important influencing factors in hooking up. Some, though, have looked at personality, but not in the same way that we have. They've looked at personality looking at very limited traits, very narrowly defined personality traits as variables. Things like sensation-seeking, unconventionality, excitement-seeking, impulsivity, social deviance, inability to tolerate boredom, those sorts of things as predicting whether or not somebody might hook up. Few studies, though, in fact, there have only been a couple, and they didn't do what we did, tried to look at all of these variables, personality and alcohol, simultaneously, to try to tease apart, to try to disentangle, what's going on. Our big interest was in determining if personality on its own merits, without the influence of alcohol, would in fact be a predictor of hooking up. As I mentioned earlier, most of the studies have looked at very narrowly defined traits, personality traits associated them with hooking up. What we did is we looked at the 5-factor model. Many of you are probably familiar with that, sometimes referred to in the vernacular as the Big Five. There's a long history here, about 70 years, of factor analytic studies that have demonstrated that if you take all of the adjectives, and there are many thousand of them, that can describe a person's personality, that can describe a person, and if you do the analyses of those, there will emerge 5 factors at the most abstract level that will describe the human personality. And all of those other thousands of factors will fall under those 5. So there's sort of an umbrella that overarches over all of these other thousands of personality traits. And those are neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And under each of those, there are 6 facets or personality traits that are facets that are strongly associated with each one of those 5. So our interest was in finding which of those big 5, if any or all of them, any combination of them, and the facets predicted hooking up in undergraduate students. While we were controlling for alcohol, because we wanted, that's an important part of this, and Elaine will talk about the role of that. So these were the research questions that we had for this first study. Which big 5 factors and the corresponding facets predict hooking up? And by the way, this is not a joking with some of the guys who were here early, who were really chomping at the bit because they thought they were going to hear more about things to support what that slide showed you up there earlier. This is not a how-to session. It's not how to pick somebody out in a lineup who's most prone to wanting to hook up. Although you might, by inference,
you have to give them a personality inventory.
You could, yeah. You could give them the 260 item NEOPIR and then do a quick analysis and see what you come up with. And
Gary can supply that for them.
But we were interested in learning which of those factors predict hooking up. Whether global alcohol use, and Elaine will talk a little bit about what we mean by global alcohol use, if that predicts hooking up. And among those who have hooked up, and we looked at different manifestations or types of hookups, oral sex and or intercourse within 24 hours of meeting someone, what are the personalities of coital, that is having intercourse during hookup, versus non-coital hookups that would involve other sexual behaviors. Elaine, I'll turn it over to you. You can talk a little bit about the methods.
We used as participants students right here at UNI a few years back. They were in the Human Relationships and Sexuality course. We did have an oversample of females, so we had 193 females, only 54 males, mean age about 19 and a half. And they were given the personality inventory that Gary just talked about so we could assess their personality profile using the Big Five. Hooking up behavior was one of the items that probably garners the most discussion in terms of measurement. So how do you measure hooking up behavior? Because from being around a college campus, I pick up on the notion that people use the term hooking up, but they use it very differently. So if you said someone hooked up, someone might take that very differently than what you originally meant by it. But the way that we did operationally define it here was in 4 different ways. So participants were asked if they had had intercourse once and only once, intercourse with someone known less than 24 hours, oral sex received from someone known less than 24 hours, and oral sex performed on someone known less than 24 hours. We also did address alcohol use, and we used that to control that variable because we wanted to make sure that when we looked at these personality factors that alcohol use wasn't playing a role. So for instance, people who are more extroverted are more likely to drink more, but we wanted to make sure that it was actually the extroversion, not the drinking, that was causing the hooking up behavior or related to the hooking up behavior. So that's why we did use alcohol use as a variable in our study. Okay, very simple percentages of men and women who have hooked up. And we actually, just for the ease of presentation, combined the performed and received oral sex variable here with someone known less than 24 hours. So you can see that men are more likely to have hooked up than women in our sample. And I know your first question is if most of the participants, which they were straight, and indicated that they were heterosexual. Who are the men hooking up with if the women are not hooking up at a higher rate than men? So my original answer to that was probably girls from Hawkeye. That's not what the data indicates.
Only she said it because they were not part of the sample. Nothing about
Right. So when we go back and we look at the data, what we found out is that with having, for instance, intercourse with someone once and only once, there were a lot of men who had had intercourse with someone once and only once, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. There were more women who had had intercourse once and only once, 0 times, but those who had done it more times. Does that make sense? Okay, because that's usually the first question we get when people look at this data. So alcohol use, not surprisingly, was positively related to all 3 definitions of hooking up, and this was global alcohol use. So not were you using alcohol use at the time of the hookup, but overall, globally, how often do you use alcohol? This is our profile, if you will, of individuals who are most likely to hook up. So those who are more neurotic, so that's a factor on the big 5 that kind of means you're dramatic, you make a mountain out of a molehill. People who are more extroverted.
A lot of anxiety in your life,
right.
Paranoia. Even.
People who are more extroverted were more likely to hook up. People who were less conscientious. And interestingly, those who were less agreeable and also less openness to experience. Is there anything you want to add?
Well, let's take a quick look at, I think the first 3 probably aren't big surprises. You know, the people. Why do you think people who are more neurotic, and we didn't get at the reasons, we can speculate on them, but why do you think people who are more neurotic, people who are more anxious, people who are have more fear governing their lives, or more emotionally unstable, why do you think that they are more likely to hook up than those who would have more emotional stability in their personalities? Yeah, the back.
They might need more fulfillment. So
could be a need, an attempt to satisfy a need for fulfillment, that people who are more emotionally stable. And the opposite of neuroticism, the way these big 5 are structured is that we've got these 5 personality factors. So they don't talk about Costa and McRae and others who deal with the big 5, don't talk about the opposites. But the opposite of neuroticism is emotional stability. So if that helps you get a sense of what neuroticism is. Other factors you think might influence this?
We're going to look at it.
Okay.
There could be if they're on antidepressants or what, the want to release endorphins.
Okay, could be. Yeah.
They're less likely to maintain a relationship.
Okay. And there's quite a lot of research supporting that as well. She said that perhaps people who are more neurotic are less likely to be able to successfully maintain a relationship. And all of those are really good potential explanations that could bear further research. What about extroversion? Why, if you're looking for a hookup, should you concentrate on the extroverts? They're more fun, right?
They're easier to talk to?
Yeah, that may be part of it. Easier to talk to. Yeah, they're less conscientious. Probably not a big surprise. Less agreeable. Let's take a couple minutes on these 2, the last 2. Why do you think that people who are less agreeable less likely to, gregariousness is part of this, to go along with others, to agree with others, to agree with suggestions that others might offer. You'd think that if you were more agreeable, you'd be more prone to want to hook up. Why less agreeable?
They may be lonely. They don't have many friends then. If they're not as agreeable.
Could very well be, yeah. How about less open to experience? This one, a lot of people think, well, if you're open to experience and want to try all kinds of new things, from foreign foods to, all sorts of earthly delights, you're made to hook up. Why would openness to experience, why would people who are less open to experience be more likely to hook up? Because openness to experience really what it refers to, what that construct refers to, is openness to artistic experience, multiple perspectives, divergent perspectives. It doesn't necessarily mean living out all dimensions of your life, but rather being discerning, being more critical. So that's really what's going on there. And of course, those people are probably going to be more likely or less likely to want to hook up. Do we have more? Okay. All right. The next study, we'll come back. If you want to ask any questions about any of these three studies, if you just hold on to your questions. One of our concerns has been getting through all of the material here. We're going to go into the next one here quickly. So if you have questions, we'd like to entertain those. This was primarily Elaine's study, looking at sexual regret among college women, so I'll let her introduce it.
Okay, after we completed the initial study on hooking up, still a lot of questions remain, and there is still not a lot of research literature that is out there on hooking up. And one thing that we actually did not find in quantitative works, we found more qualitatively, was the role of sexual regret. And if you have more experience in hooking up behaviors, whether or not that tends to be related to sexual regret. So 72%, according to previous research, of sexually active college students have at least one sexual regret. Now, we do see a gender difference with sexual regret, which I found quite interesting when I got into the literature. Women are more likely to regret something they did. Men are more likely to regret something they didn't do. Does that make sense? So women are more likely to say, I shouldn't have gone home with that guy last night. What are men more likely to say? I blew it. I could have gone home with that girl last night, but it didn't happen. Okay, so they tend to show differences in the type of regret that they have. After a hookup, women are more likely to ruminate, meaning they think a lot about it. They analyze it. Men are more likely just to feel satisfied. And that's what previous research has shown us. Because of the gender difference that women tend to regret the commission, women tend to regret doing something, men tend to regret not doing something. For the purposes of this study, we decided to look just at women. And we used the same sample as before, but what we did is excluded men, and we also excluded women who indicated that they had not been sexually active, because we wanted to look at how hooking up behavior related to sexual regret. So, very simple way of measuring sexual regret, and you can see here. We just asked them on a 4-point scale to indicate how many regrets they had about sexual decisions they had made. So 23% of sexually active college women said they had no regrets. 61%, so this is the big yellow area, said they had a few regrets. 13% said they had some regrets, and then 2.5% said that they had many regrets. So our question became, who are the women? What is unique about the women in terms of their past sexual behaviors in particular? What is unique about these women who have more or less sexual regret? So those who are more likely to have more regret or indicate a higher score on that scale that we gave them were those who were more religious, those who had had a greater number of intercourse partners in the last year, those who had had an earlier age at first intercourse, so started having intercourse earlier in life. And then in terms of hooking up, we found that 3 of the 4 behaviors we measured were related to sexual regret. So those who had had intercourse with someone once and only once, those who had intercourse with someone known less than 24 hours, and interestingly, those who had received but not performed oral sex with someone known less than 24 hours were more prone or more likely to say that they had experienced more regret. Now, I found this a little bit interesting. What is not related to sexual regret among women? So these were things that we found didn't have any relationship with increased sexual regret. The first one is cheating on a partner. So women did not indicate that they had more sexual regret if they had cheated on a partner in the past. No relationship there. Number of oral sex partners in the last year, and then the hooking up behavior, performing oral sex on someone known less than 24 hours. So this will relate to our next study of what is sex, but we're finding that many of the oral sex behaviors are not related to sexual regret, where the intercourse may be. Can I add anything on to that? Okay, so I'm going to let Gary introduce the last study we're going to talk about today, where we will talk about what exactly is defined as sex among college students.
All right. What are you reacting to? All right. Earlier than when we collected data for the first 2 studies, the last 2 studies we talked about here, several years before that, I collected data motivated by something that was in the news back in the mid-90s, and that was the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. We collected the data, and we were interested in. Well, let me first play what President Clinton has to say here. Our study was called "Sex for You, but Not for Me: Discontinuity in Undergraduate Emerging Adults' Definitions of Having Sex." And many of you will remember, some of you are quite young, this famous speech.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
And I don't bring this up in an attempt to try to politicize what we're doing at all. That's not the point of this. Back in, at about that time, researchers at Indiana University, Sanders and Reinisch, had done a study looking at undergraduates, and it was a very well done study. They had a list of 11 sexual behaviors that could potentially constitute having had sex. They gave this large sample of undergraduates this list of behaviors, and this is just a sampling of a few of the items. You engaged in deep kissing with a person. A person fondled your genitals. You had oral contact with a person's genitals. You engaged in vaginal intercourse with another person. So there were 11 of these altogether. And people were asked, as part of it was embedded within a much larger survey, were asked to respond to each of these 11 items, indicating, would you consider this behavior sex? Yes or no. You did this to a person did this to you. Is this sex? Yes or no? And what they found, which shocked non-undergraduates, I think undergraduates throughout the country probably thought, well, yeah, so what's the news here? But people who are older than undergraduates, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, were shocked by the finding that 60% of the sample did not label their participation in oral genital contact as having had sex. So the adults in our culture, so to speak, were saying, what do you mean? How can you say that oral sex is not sex? These undergraduates are crazy. They define sex the same way Clinton and Lewinsky do. Remember Lewinsky, when she was talking to her friend Linda Tripp, said, oh, Linda, we weren't having sex. We were just, what did she call it? Just messing around, I think is what she called it. So this created a big stir in the news and in the culture back then that undergraduates were defining sex in the same way that Clinton was. Well, my interest was not so much in how people define sex, how undergraduates define sex, But if there was a double standard, I couldn't technically call it a double standard, but rather if there was a discontinuity in how undergraduates define sex, depending upon whether or not they're performing the sex act, or if their significant other, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, is engaging in the same sex act with somebody else outside the relationship. So, for example, performing oral sex on somebody. Is it sex when I do it? Okay. But if my significant other performs oral sex on somebody else, this person is my significant other. Is it sex? You bet it's sex, right? Do people hold, their significant others to a much higher standard regarding these behaviors than they do themselves? That is sex? What is sex contextualized? Does it depend upon the situation and whether you're the actor or whether you're being what we might consider cheated against? So that's what I was interested in doing. So what we did, we were interested, of course, in how people define sex. We wanted to see if it was contextual for the sample, and we wanted to see if there were gender differences as well. I'll talk real quickly here about them. We had a very large sample. Students in a human sexuality class, we used what's called a between participants design. All students all participants completed a very lengthy sexual history survey. Embedded within that sexual history survey were 11 items, and they were the same items that Sanders and Reinisch at the Indiana University study used. However, we had two forms, and nobody knew of the participants knew that there were two forms. Randomly, half of them got Form A and half of them got Form B. Those that received Form A was the same as the Indiana University survey. If you engage in this behavior, is it sex? If your significant other does this, if somebody does this to you, is it sex? If you do this to somebody else, is it sex? Form B, they got the significant other version. If your significant other does this to someone, is this sex? If someone does this to your significant other, is this sex? And our hypothesis was that people would have a much more stringent, much more exacting, demanding definition of sex for their significant other, would hold them to a higher standard than they would themselves. That was our hypothesis looking at this. Some people ask, well, why didn't you just ask everybody the same question? All 800 and however many of them. Just ask them, both questions. Why could we not do that? Why did we have to split the sample in half and give one half Form A and one half Form B? Do we have an idea?
The answers to one might influence the answer to the other.
That's right. If you answer one question about yourself, you are immediately sensitized to that question, and then you have to answer it about your significant other, and that is probably in some way that we can't determine going to shape, how you answer that. So to avoid that effect, we had to split them, and the samples were identical. We did the tests on them and found that they were essentially the same samples, so there was no problem there. So Form A and Form B, comparing those, and some of our findings. Elaine, why don't you talk about some of those? This isn't all of them by any means.
No. We'll start over here on the left with this is the lowest percentage we had for people considering an item sex. So even you'll find for deep kissing, when participants were asked, is deep kissing, if you deep kiss with someone else, is that considered sex? We only had about 8% who said yes. But when we said, if your significant other deep kiss someone else, would that be sex? And immediately that popped up to about 17%. And we saw similar findings throughout. So people were much more likely to identify behaviors as sex when their significant other was mentioned as doing them or being a part of them, rather than themselves. So we find, as we go to the right here, a bigger difference. So I'll read these. I don't know how well you can see them in the back. So deep kissing had oral contact with someone's breasts, had breasts orally stimulated, fondled someone's genitals. So interestingly enough, real big difference on that one. So when people were asked, is that sex if you do it? About 15% said yes. About 35% said yes when they were referring to a significant other. Similar trend for had genitals fondled. So, now, the only thing that we found identical between self and other is that if you're talking about yourself or you're talking about another, 100% of participants consider it sex if it is vaginal intercourse. However, all the other behaviors, we saw at least some difference in that people were more likely to consider a behavior sex if their significant other was participating in it, rather than themselves.
And in fact, of all of those 11 behaviors that were paired, the difference was statistically significant between the two groups, between Form A and Form B, on 9 out of the 11. The only two for which it wasn't was anal intercourse and vaginal intercourse. That can't be. There are many more slides.
Are you sure that's the slide?
Do
you have it on here?
Yeah.
Why don't you just have that
I'll
here?
tell you what. Why don't that's very strange. I'm sorry. Yeah. Let's see. Very weird. Can we change this so that they can't see what's on here? I'm gonna look through some of this stuff. There's all kinds of garbage on here that you guys don't care about.
Can you mute the screen?
It might be on a different flash drive. Sorry about this. Another flash drive.
Does anybody have any questions while Gary's working on that? Any questions, comments, anything surprising, interesting? Yeah, please.
I have a question about the representativeness of your first study, the sample
Mm-hmm.
studies. Are you at all concerned that the enormous amount of females compared to males, that ratio is throwing off your data in the first study? Or?
Not necessarily. When we look at the overall number of hookups, that's going to look a little bit lower because we have more females than males. But when we look at it by gender, I mean, it shouldn't make any difference in terms of how many males and females there were. So if we throw all the data in together, it's a little misleading because women had fewer hookups than men. But when we partial them out by gender, it isn't going to be an issue in that way. So overall results, I think that's why it's important to look at the hookup behavior by gender and not just overall. So, yeah.
When you talked about sexual regret, were there any control in the studies that you referenced in regard to different sex behaviors versus same-sex behaviors? Or did you look at it primarily just by male and female?
For sexual regret,
Right.
Participants were asked their sexual orientation, and I believe we had about 97% indicate that they were heterosexual, but we did not ask about the sexual behavior, so the hooking up behaviors if it was with a same-sex or an opposite-sex partner. That would actually be very interesting. So, yeah, good question.
What about like the type of class it was in? Like, wasn't it like a sex class? So you have to be extroverted enough to get in the sex class, and then boys have to be extroverted enough to know if they're going to be in a sex class with like 170 women.
That's a real good point.
Yeah.
There is a pretty good body of research that goes back a number of years looking at what type of person, those of you who are here from the human sexuality class, we're talking about you again, what type of a person with a choice opts to take a human relationships and sexuality class. And the research is quite clear that people who take that class are, if given the choice, if it's an elective, are different from those who opt not to. So there is a bias here. These are people who are different from general population of undergraduates, even at UNI. So we can't generalize to all UNI undergraduates. It is a very different kind of sample. Did you want to say more about that? Okay, all right.
I just wanted to comment that the dictionary used to have the phrase sexual relations, and it meant vaginal intercourse. Mm-hmm. It was specific. And Clinton grew up with it, you know, and he was a lawyer. I mean, it was in the dictionary until after it started. People didn't used to talk for us. And then they didn't do it. It just meant
Right.
Right. And that unleashed, I mean, not that one incident, of course, but it was a critical part, a significant part to a cultural shift. You know, parents were suddenly in a position of, you know, like, once in a while, you know, kids would come to their parents and ask, what is oral sex? But, I mean, parents were being deluged with, you know, requests from their children. Why not? What is oral sex? What's this oral sex? They're talking about it on the news. What's oral sex? What's this? And then it just, it contributed to a cultural shift, that's for sure. I found more notes, or what should have been on the slides. Should I run through these quickly here? Okay. And then we'll just open it up to general questions. The next slide would have asked the question, okay, why is hooking up so prevalent among undergraduates? You know, it's a common behavior. I mean, the majority of undergraduates in our study and all the other studies have, in one form or another, one of its manifestations or another, engaged in hooking up. One of our explanations is, many of you are probably familiar with this concept, what is called fundamental attribution error, or FAE, it's sometimes abbreviated. And we would have a definition up here on the slide of fundamental attribution error, and it's the tendency of an observer to perceive another person's behavior as caused by internal personal characteristics, character flaws, limitations, there's something wrong with that person, a deficiency within that person. Conversely, your own behavior, if you engage in the same behavior, you see it as caused by the situation. So for example, well, your significant other engages in this behavior. Well, of course it's sex. She's a dirty slut, right? Well, how about for yourself? Oh, well, you got to understand. She came up to me, and her breasts were in my face. What was I supposed to do? I was under pressure, and I haven't been in the situation for the last 3 days. And you rationalize, you contextualize the situation, you rationalize, and cut yourself a break, but accuse the other person by, pointing to a problem, a character flaw within that person. And we do that all the time. The best of us do that. We absolve ourselves and blame others for the same thing. So that's part of probably what's going on. But you'll probably remember that the title of the study used the term emerging adulthood. Some of you might be familiar with that construct. Within about the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a movement within developmental psychology and human development to identify this period from the late teens through the late 20s that characterizes people within that age group in affluent countries, calling it emerging adulthood rather than using Erickson's old notion of identity development being the critical thing that has to be done in the teens and then relationship development in the 20s. The argument behind emerging adulthood is that we are deferring growing up. That people in affluent countries, such as the United States, you don't have to get a job at 18. You can go to college, you can take it easy, you can go to college and take it easy. You can explore and get to know your values and experiment and do all kinds of stuff and defer growing up until you're 25, 28, 30. So development, that kind of development is postponed, and it takes longer for college students to, adults might say, people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, grow up than was the case, a few decades ago. So, and it's something that is a luxury of 21st century, affluent culture. So one of the things we look at, which we don't have a lot of time to, we weren't going to get into this much today, is hooking up something that is just part of the zeitgeist. It's just part of the times today among college students because we have the opportunity, you guys have the opportunity to postpone growing up. You can explore, you can do other things. There's a cultural permissiveness, that wasn't there, 40, 50 years ago. And it's part of the larger culture that's, supportive of it. Adults may, frown, but upon the behavior, but it's part of the culture, and it's part of a function of emerging adulthood. So that's one of the things that we raised in the article. Okay, questions from you guys?
I don't know how far back you went, but did you see a change in behavior when the drinking age was changed from 18 to 21?
Our data, that's a good question. Our data did not go back that far. What is sex data? That was from, I think I collected that back in 2001, and the other data was in 2008. So we don't have a comparison.
But in other literature, did you see?
Yeah, I haven't seen anything that has looked at that. Elaine, have you?
No, I haven't seen that.
That's a really good question, because I would think that would be a critical variable.
All undergrads drinking to about a fourth drinking.
Right. Yeah.
I hear half of the students here now 1/4 drinking. Yeah. 1/4 legally drinking. Right, got it. Right. Good question. Over here.
You said you control for general alcohol use. Did you control for alcohol use at the time of the hookup?
No, they were not asked if they were drunk at the time of the hookup. So, we did find that people who drink more in general are more prone to hookups, but our research didn't look at that immediate alcohol use. Some other studies have done that, and obviously found that drinking before the hookup, is very prevalent. But ours looked at global alcohol use. So, good question.
Have either of you, and I guess this question would be more for Gary, simply because you've been teaching for longer than Elaine, I assume.
Stop.
Well, have you noticed any attitude changes toward the material you present? I mean, obviously, you're presenting some pretty taboo topics, and I just wonder if the reaction to or the acceptance of those topics has lessened over time. Has there been more of a divide between those that accept it and those that completely reject this new secular lifestyle?
Right. Okay, that is a really good question, and I kick myself on a fairly regular basis these days for not having continued collecting the data that I started collecting from my students back in, I think it went back to 1998. Starting in 98, 99, for several years, I had all the students in the sexuality class complete a very lengthy, almost exhaustive sexual history kind of a questionnaire. It was an anonymous thing, completely anonymous, IRB approval, all that, so don't worry about it. But did that for 4 or 5 years, and then for a variety of just practical reasons, stopped doing it. But at the same time, since about 2000 up to the present, I've also used a discussion board, an anonymous discussion board in the sexuality class, where students can talk about sexuality issues, they can ask one another questions anonymously, they can discuss experiences, all that kind of stuff. So that has continued, and I've been able to do that for a number of years now, and I've got a good sampling over a period of about 12 years of the discussion board. The conversations on the discussion board, the topics that students are interested in discussing, how forthcoming they're willing to be, how absolutely, in some cases, crass they are in discussing these things, has evolved so tremendously. I mean, it's just remarkable over 12 years ago. Part of this, I think, is a function of people using electronic media and using discussion boards and being much more comfortable with that sort of thing. But I think it also provides a good, measure of how comfortable students are talking about sex, and it is a fairly good, I think, barometer of sexual behavior and what they're thinking about and what they're involved in. What I'm kicking myself for is that I didn't continue to collect those data every year using that survey, because then I would be able to do, over a period of 12 years, you've got this data set from 2000, this from a different sample, this data set, different sample 2001, this data set 2002. Then you could do what's called a time lag study. It wouldn't be longitudinal because it's a different sample every time, but you would be able to see the shift over time, and I'm sure it would be dramatic. Absolutely. I think our culture has become much more comfortable with sexuality, much more casual about sexuality, much more relaxed about kinds of things we talk about. Yeah.
Is there any discourse right now about hooking up experimentations with different types of sex and attitudes towards sexual orientation and gender identity? So how one identifies in conjunction with their attitudes toward what types of sex are sex, etc.
I have not, Elaine, I have not seen anything on that. Part of the problem with gathering and collecting those kinds of data is that if you're using undergraduate audiences, sexuality classes, you're not going to have the numbers of people who identify as anything but heterosexuality to give you enough variance, when you do the analysis. If you don't have that, the kind of analysis wouldn't be of any value. So that's probably the big limit. Not that those numbers can't be had, can't be gotten, but it would take some serious funding to be able to get access to the kinds of populations that would give you large samples of people who don't identify as heterosexual. But I haven't seen anything. That doesn't mean certainly it hasn't been done.
Sort of along with his question, have you seen any evolution as far as faculty opinions of the work? I'm just curious because I would think that the students are much more liberal approaching the topic.
They still don't care. Okay, I'm sorry.
No,
I want to take your question. Having been stupid there, I want to take your question seriously. So, what are you asking?
Oh, just have you seen over the years how faculty or fellow academics approach you studying this topic, which is relatively taboo and probably, I would assume, met not met as pleasantly as it would be with students. Or maybe that's not true.
I haven't.
I was just curious your experience.
I also work in gerontology, and I have a very different research interest and teaching interest where I also look at hospice and Alzheimer's and end-of-life care. And at a faculty reception, no one has really ever wanted to talk to me about any of that stuff. But every once in a while, someone will bring up the sexuality stuff. So I don't know. There are those who are interested, but many times I think with faculty research, people kind of work on their own things and work independently. So I don't know if you get a lot of feedback in general from other faculty. That's a good question.
I haven't. I don't know. I welcome it.
When I was an undergraduate here, when I was Iowa State Teachers College, undergraduate women had to live in the dorm, and the curfew during the week was 10 o'clock. People cared, and parents expected the school to take care of their girls.
In parentis localis, I believe was the term that was used. The Latin term referred to local, the responsibility of the institution being the local parents. Local parents.
I want to get away from the mic. Is there a lot of undue presumption about the nature of casual encounters and of the emotional impacts, emotional causes? I mean, we talked earlier about people who are neurotic or who have issues with relationships, but is it also a significant factor that a lot of people just enjoy having sex rather than have any kind of difficulties that cause them to seek out these encounters?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that, there is, I'm certainly not going to claim that people who are engaging in hookups, the vast majority of people who are engaging in hookups, there's some pathology that's lurking, under the surface that's motivating them to do so. I mean, our concern was really was a public health concern. And I think especially with the third study, how do you define sex? Well, if you don't think that anything is sex, and you don't think that receiving oral sex, or giving oral sex, or some of these other behaviors are sex, and you go in to see your physician, and your physician doesn't do a very careful job of gathering the sexual history, and the physician says, as many do, are you sexually active? Well, I've given oral sex to this many people, and received it from this many people. Oh, I don't know, because, I'm not having intercourse. So that was more our concern. That and when you're talking to a new partner, and you're looking at asking those hard questions, to try to determine what the person's sexual history is, and people say, well, no, I don't have any sexual history. I haven't had sex. I'm clean, but the person has engaged in lots of oral sex. Putting him or her at significant sex risk. I mean, because you can get chlamydia, gonorrhea, human papillomavirus all in your throat. It's not just, those are not diseases that are limited, and others too, are not just limited to the genitals, and not just limited to contracting those from having intercourse. So that was one of the things that we wanted to look at is the issue of public health concern.
I think also to go back to your question about maybe some people just like to have sex. One of the limitations of research in this area is, and it will continue to be a limitation, I don't know how to necessarily amend this, but we're getting the perspective of one person on a hooking up experience. We're not getting the perspective of their hookup buddy as well. So one of the issues becomes ambiguity. So there may be somebody who, there's nothing underlying that they're seeking out. Maybe they just like to have sex. but the key is, in that case, they maybe need to find somebody else who just likes to have sex, because I think the ambiguity of such encounters is sometimes problematic because people have different expectations, and that's something that, you know, a little bit of qualitative research has mentioned, but there has not been a study where they've talked to, you know, two people who had participated together in a hooking up behavior to see their perceptions of the encounter.
And I would think that a good deal of the sexual regret that you looked at, and that we talked about, that Elaine talked about in the middle study, is a result of that disparity between needs.
All right, I think that's all the time we have for Q&A. I forgot to mention before the talk that we have speaker rating cards on each chair, so if you'd like to fill those out, you can keep them.
We would have tried a lot harder.
That's right. I had no
That
idea.
thing about the slides, that was Gary. I didn't know.
Yeah,
We can disregard that. Yeah, you can either leave them on your chair and we'll come and pick them up, or you can bring them to the back of the room. And also, we have free popping cookies in the back that no one's taking, so take free popping cookies, because why not? So, thank you.
If you are interested in any of the articles, we can send you copies. So.